Well, this is Baruch Fleischman here at the Tikkun Elevator Kollel, and I'm back again. I had a rough week last week where I had become severely dehydrated, and have been hydrating myself ever since. So I'm trying to get back on track. Where we want to be, unfortunately I missed last week, so I missed a lot of things that I could have, would have, should have said. We're on Drush Vov, the Inyan of Pesach. The area that we're going to talk about today is the Bo Ba'arech, so we'll read the first line. Seder Leil Pesach, the order of what happens on Pesach. The Hamatzos, and we're going to talk about the secret of what the matzos represent. Arba Kosos, and the 4 kos of wine. The Karpas. Begam Acharoses. Kol Inyani Leil Pesach. That's what we're talking about. Now, in order to learn this, though, we have to do Hakdama. As we've said before many times, is that the whole concept of Kabbalah is a Hakdama to Hakdama. Hakdama. Hakdama means an introduction, but it really also means a doorway. But in order to get to the door, to get through the door, you have to understand the precepts that are in it. So if you want to know what's going on with the 4 cups of wine and with the matzahs, you have to have some background in self. Let me see if I can tilt this better. Does that still work? It does. So we're going to start about this. This is Hakdama, the Drush Vov. And we'll learn a certain amount of it today and a certain amount tomorrow. I'm not saying that this is material that you've ever heard before. So although we've discussed in previous shiurim, and I hope that some of you saved these shiurim, but I hope that we're going to see that we have seen that we talked about what's going on in Pesach and what power represents and exactly how we were repressed in that terrible time. But over here we're going to start talking about the seder table itself and what goes on. So the Tiv writes like this. This is his drush, and we'll read down to the bottom over here with God's help. We'll try to understand the principles if I have to, or if I can, make a drawing or two. Yesh tahakna devar as derek harishash hamizboyer be'etz chaim. So this is rishash. This is something that was brought out in the Eitz Chaim, the Ri. Be'inyan madregas hamochin, to the different levels of mochin. Because what we know is that the breaking out of the slavery, the bondage in which we found ourselves then, required extreme elevation of consciousness, which is bringing in the mochin, a different mochin, the mochin of Gadlus. And now we're going to learn about this, a concept called mochin de Katnus. V'chein as inyan ha-Katnus v'Gadlus ha-rishon v'hasheni. So it turns out that in talks of Gadlus, we means expanded consciousness. Katnus really means more or less what we're like all the time, more in a defensive pose, rather than be able to see God's hand. So he says like this: there are 2 different kinds of Gadlus and 2 different kinds of Katnus. There's a Gadlus Rishon, there's a Gadlus Sheni, there's a Katnus Rishon, and there's a Katnus Sheni. So he says, Hine Hazer Anpin, B'Techilas Briyasa, from the time that Zer Anpin was born out of Ima, Hu Mushlam B'Partzufi HaNefesh V'Haruach HaKolim. Zer Anpin had 6 spherules, which are basically Chagat 9. Chesed Gevurah Tiferes Netzach Hod Yesod. And those represent, and Malchus as well, and those represent what we call Ruach and Nefesh. The Ruach is Zer Anpin, and the Nefesh is Malchus. B'kol echad me'elach ha-partzufim yesh bo nerantchi pratim. And each one of these partzufim, he says they have a nerantchi, a specific nerantchi to each one. Now what is nerantchi? It's Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaim, Yechida, Pratim. So specific to every partzuf, there is a set of lights that goes with it, and those lights are called nerantchi. So he says, V'hine chamisha partzufim kolalim elu. So these 5 partzufim that cover Zer Anpin, omdim zeh lifnim b'zeh. So one is inside of the next. V'hainu hanefesh hu hachitzon mikulim. And so in every single olam, in every partzuf, the nefesh is always the light which is on the outside, which would mean it was the most dim because it's furthest away from the Ein Sof Baruch Hu. V'lifnim mimenu, that inside of them is the concept of Ruach. Lifnim mimenu, inside of that, who's the Neshama. V'achrav v'achai v'achrav ha'yechida. So these are the 5 different categories of light that are represented by the concept of Naranchi, which influence the mochin that come into us and our expanded consciousness. The nimsa b'dechidus atzilus azah. So it comes like this at the beginning, when Zer Anpin was first born out. Hoyu mushlam b'chasara partzufim. He was complete. He had 10 different partzufim. The hainu naranchi the nefesh, because he said, this is what he's saying. He's saying like this, there's a naranchi of the concept of nefesh. So what does that mean? That means in the nefesh, the ruach, the neshama, the chayin yechida, which represents naranchi, because that's an acrostic for naranchi. He said each one of them there's a naranchi. Then the naranchi, the ruach. Vehine, kol avodoseinu hu lahashlim lo as shlosha partzufim b'chos hachaserin lo. So he says that everything that you're doing, so we just said before that Zer Anpin is born with a ruach and neshama. What about the rest? What about the neshama? He's born with, let me say that again if I said it right. He's born with a ruach and a nefesh. Those are the lowest two levels. The ruach refers to his chagat, and the nefesh refers to his nai. So that's the way Zer Anpin is born. He's a vok, chagat nai. He says that within each one of those is also a naranchi. So the ruach, there's a naranchi of ruach, and there's a naranchi of nefesh. So everything that we do in this world, lahashlim lo as shlosha partzufim hachaserin lo, is to bring into Zer Anpin the three partzufim that he's missing. That is the partzuf of neshama, the partzuf of chaya, and the partzuf of yechida. The hainu sheyakabel neshama v'chaya v'yechida hakolulim. So al-klaliim, he calls them klaliim. That is, that the general concept of those, that light, those lights of both ruach and neshama should come in. Parts of the neshama, whom makabo me Yisrael sabat devuna shehem and the koyim neshama be'erik klalos olomos. Now let me stop right there. Let me see if I got a drawing I could pull up, and maybe that'll help us a little bit. So what we're going to be dealing with right here is the concept of naranchi, which is nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, yechida. One inside the next, and the most outside is going to be the nefesh. Now what he's saying is that the nefesh itself has its own naranchi. So imagine that it's light refraction. And so that you have one great light, which is going to be the yechida, and then you have lesser lights going down as it refracted more and more until you have the light which is represented by the nefesh. So nefesh, chaya, neshama, chaya, nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yechida. So let's see what goes on. I got a spelling there. Great. Okay, let's go on. He says parts of a chaya, whom mekabel ma'aba be'ima eloim. Okay, that was one of the things I wanted to look for. Give me a second. Let me see if I can find it. So let's take a moment and look at this drawing. The title of the page is the ratio of the issue. This is a different subject. But I wanted to give you an idea of what we're talking about. The concept of Eric Anpin. This is Eric Anpin. These are the spheros of Eric Anpin, and they could be studied independently. Surrounding Eric Anpin, from approximately his neck going downwards, is the parts of Abba and Ima. This is also called Abba Ve'ima Imoyin, or as a group they're called Chochma. Subsequent to them is another parts of, can we see this? Let me bring this down a little bit closer. It's called Yisrael Saba. It's like a sub parts of it. Really represents the lower half of Abba Ve'ima Imoyin. And another one called Tabuna, and this is Yisrael Saba Tabuna. These two, Yisrael Saba Tabuna, are really a sub aspect of Abba Ve'ima Eloyin, the higher Abba Ve'ima Eloyin, which are these, all of these are wraps. They wrap around each other different ways. And then ultimately, this shepherd would come down to Malchus and go through the various stages of the Teferetz, Chesed, Gevura, that's Binak, Chesed, Gevura, Teferetz, Netzach, Chod, Yisod, and Malchus, and that's the way things would function. Now let's come over here again, get back to where we were reading, 1 second. So the Tiv writes that the parts of Chaya, so he's saying that each one of these lights is a system of light processing called the parts of. So each one of them has its own parts. Let's look at the parts of Chaya. They are related to Abba V'Ima Eloyin. In other words, that level of light, which is represented here. Within the light that is being processed here is the light of Chaya, right? He says, Abba V'Ima Eloyin HaNikram Chaya B'Klalos. They are the Chaya of the group of Nerantim. Well, parts of a Yechidah, Humakabel Erik Anpin. So therefore, in Erik Anpin, which is this big line, which is the center around which everything falls, he says that this is related to the concept of light within it is the light of Yechidah. So he says, then we go over here, we say like this. Hachaza de Erik Anpin, Mamish Kakumas Yislim, we find the place. V'hine b'kol pam shebekabel apartzufim elyonim, is every time that the upper partzufim receive light, harihu nigdal, that is their anpin. Yeah, that's where I'm at. He said, "V'hine b'kol pam shebekabel apartzufim elyonim, harihu nigdal lihiyos kamosam." That is that these partzufim come into their anpin. Let's see if we can see it from this. Well, let's just get the idea that this whole parts of is ultimately coming into this vok, which is their anpin, which is Chesed Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yisod, and ultimately coming into Malchus. So let's just get an idea of how things feed into each other. Parts of the neshama mi Yisrael Sabbath Devun. Let me go back. So start here at the Hine again. Hine b'kol pam shebekabel partzufim elyonim, harihu nigdal lihiyos kamosam. So that as the partzufim come into Zer Anpin, he grows up to be the size of them. Now they also grow up, but in a different fashion. But he grows up to the level of them. The B'dechidas Atzilusa, when Zer Anpin at first appeared, shehoyebo nevesh v'ruach hashaychem l'chelko, that he had a nevesh and a ruach. Those nefesh of ruach that we said previously are always with Zer Anpin. That is Zer Anpin. He is a nefesh and ruach. Egia kumazo ad tibur de Erik Anpin. So how high did Zer Anpin reach in terms of the body of Erik Anpin? Imagine Erik Anpin is a man who is being clothed by these other partzufim. So here, this partzuf covers Erik Anpin from his tibur ulamata. Which is where Zah is normally. That's where Zah is in relationship to Erik Anpin. He's from the Tibur of Erik Anpin, or Lamata. Parts of the neshama mi Yisrael Sabbath Devun. Now, when the light of neshama starts to come into Zer Anpin, this light comes from the parts of which I said is a sub-parts of Abba V'Ima V'Eloyin. We call it Yisrael Sabbath Devun because this is the part of Abba V'Ima that actually feeds and builds Zer Anpin. It's called Yisrael Sabbath Devuna. He says, Mekabel parts of the neshama Yisrael Sabbath and Devuna. Nigdal V'Ola Adachaz of the Erik Anpin. It grows more. It grows to the chest of Zer Anpin, of Erik Anpin. Mamish. Yisrael Sabbath Devuna. In other words, it takes the same position as Yisrael Sabbath Devuna. And we're talking about what happens to Yisrael Sabbath Devuna because an aspect of them always moves up as well in tandem. As parts of a chaya, so therefore when it receives the parts of a chaya, because where does the parts of a chaya come from? That is the Nuranti of chaya. He says it comes from Abba V'Ima Eloyin, which is much higher, goes all the way to the neck of Erik Anpin. Nigdal Adagora, and it grows until the throat of Erik Anpin, Mamish, Abba V'Ima, and picks up the same height, the same level of light as Abba V'Ima. Makabo Yechida, the parts of Erik Anpin, and then when Zer Anpin is receiving a light from a much higher place, the highest place, then this is called the reaching the level of Nigdal ad kumaso shel Erik Anpin Nagamri. He completely overtakes the parts of Erik Anpin, which means that Erik Anpin, the essence of Erik Anpin, is going much, much higher. So he said, "V'hine a nefesh b'kol prat ne'koyim ibur." So he says that the nefesh of any part, that is the nefesh of any one of the Naranti, For Ruchshakol Prat, so he says this is what it's called. The nefesh of any part of the Neranchi is always called Ibor, which means an embryonic stage. If a Ruchshakol Prat Nikmat Yanika. So he says that the Ruach that comes from this is called Yanika. So when you talk about the higher levels, that is it's called the Nechi. Most people refer to it as its abbreviation, which is Neshama Chaim Yechida, Nechi. He says, Pratnik Chaim Gadlus. This is Gadlus. When you reach up into the Rosh area, because their Anpin is normally just a Vok, as we say many times. And all of this Nechi comes in all at the same time. So it comes out like this, that the two Partsufim, the most outside part, are called Katnus, Shehem Iber v'Yanika. So Iber and Yanika is like the stage of a child who's not mature yet. So therefore it's called, this is going to be the Hitzonis, the outside part. The Shlosha Partsufim b'Mininian Hey Gadlus, and the three, that is the Nechi versus the Ran. So look at, I'm losing the word. The Ruach Nefesh is called Ran, and the Neshama Chai Yechid is called Nechi, Gadlus. So this, but the Nechi is called Gadlus, and the Ran is called, or Ner, also you say it that way, but it's the Ran is called Katnus. So this is what the first thing that we have to know in this introduction, the most important thing. So we're learning here that there is an Neranchi, and each one of the Neranchi has a Neranchi of its own. So then we come over here and we're saying like this, is that you have Partsufim that are in the most penimis part, which is called the Nechi, the Neshama Chai Yechida. They're going to go inside of the Ran, because the Ran itself is the basic Vok, just a mind that never really develops an exterior consciousness. But on the light of night of Pesach, it's going to come in. So it says like this, so here we are, we're sitting in our seats, and on Pesach night we're going to make Kiddush and so on and so forth, and all the different parts. And we're going to be starting to receive Mochi de Gadlus. The first part, he says, is going to be the lowest part of the Nechi. The Nechi again, the Neshama Chai Yechida. The lowest part is going to come in first. That's going to be the Neshama. Translation. He said, from that neshama, their anpin is going to receive a light of consciousness that is going to come from the ramchi of neshama. And his words are shemimenu, from this neshama. Tzarik l'kabel is necessary for their anpin, which is, in this case, we're a metaphor for that. Chamisha partsufim pratim, it's going to receive a neramchi. Shehem the Ramchi the Neshama, which are the Ramchi and the Neshama. So if you go, that's in the case of Ruach. The Ruach will receive the Neranchi. Now if you go to the Iber, which is the Nefesh, whom Makabel as parts of a Nefesh, the Neshama. The Nefesh gets the Nefesh and the Neshama. Shehi Nikras parts of Iber, which is called the parts of Iber. So let's talk about the time of Yanika, which is the time of Ruach. Humakabalas of Ruach and the Neshama, then he receives the Ruach and Neshama. So Nikra parts of Yanika, which is called Yanika, but now the parts of Yanika is receiving a Neshama. Of Izmana Gadlus, Humakabal as parts of a Neshama, Chai Yechida the Neshama. So that's Katnus. He says that when the shefa that is coming from Neshama goes into the Ran, to the Ruach Neshama, Ruach Nefesh, he says that's Katnus, because Ruach Nefesh is Katnus. But the Neshama also can go into higher places in the parts. The Neshama can also go into the place of the Chai Yechida Neshama. So there, all of this, therefore, is called by the name, these names, which are important to us, which is called Katnus v'Gadlus Rishon. Why? Shahari b'Klalusan, hain parts of a neshama should be kabel lezer anpin miyisrael sapakibuna. So I'll translate and I'll try to explain. So he says, why are these called Katnus v'Gadlus Rishon? So he says the reason why, because b'Klalusan in general, this entering of this neshama, hain parts of the neshama, the parts of the neshama is coming into zer anpin, shekiba lezer anpin, And he gets this from the lower aspect of Abba Ve'ima, which is called Yisrael Sabbath Tabuna, because that's the part that actually enters into Zeranpin and brings in these modes. Madrega Rishona Shatzarach Lahamshech. So this is the first level that needs to be pulled into Zer Anpin, which would allow Zer Anpin, as we said earlier, to grow up to the level of Yisrael Sabbath Tabuna. Now going back to the Ran, the Ruach and the Neshama, and the Nefesh, sorry, I keep messing these up. The Ruach and the Nefesh, Iber v'Yanika who Katnus Rishon. That's called Katnus Rishon because Iber and Yanika, which is Iber goes is the embryonic stage, and Yanika is the stage of nursing. Those two stages are child stages, or before adulthood, before Rishon the God, most of the God. So he said the Katnus Shuha Iber v'Yanika who Katnus Rishon. So the Katnus is Katnus Rishon because whatever's coming in is coming in from Yisrael Sabbath Tabuna. But Gadlus is already the Rosh, which is Neshama Chaim Yechida. So he said Neshama Chaim Yechida, who Gadlus Arishon. This is the first Gadlus because it's taking the top three lights from Yisrael Sabbath Tabuna. Achakach Mamshik Osam also Hased Mama Kishamakabal as parts of a Chaim Abba Ve'ima Reiloin. So then what happens is that Zer Anpin grows up to be the height of Yisrael Sabbath Tabuna. Now Zer Anpin is reaching, he's calling out, and wanting his moching to Abba Ve'ima Eloyin, which is the level of Chochmah. Is Abba Ve'ima Eloyin, Shabbatachida Mekabel as a Katas Asheni. So first what he gets here now is Neshama Chai Yechida, but he said Chai Yechida. He said that was going to go into his Ran, into his Ruach and his Nefesh. As parts of a Ibor, or parts of a Yanikush, or parts of a Chaya. So in Chaya itself, there is an aspect of Ibor and there's an aspect of Yanika. This is going to come now into Zer Anpin. It's the first part of it. So he's saying like this. Katnus is always referring to what comes from Abba Ve'ima Eloyin. I just said exactly wrong. Katnus is what comes from Yisrael Sabbath Tabuna. And it depends. The Katnus Rishon is when they're getting the Ran of Yisrael Sabbath Tabuna. Katnus Sheni is when you're getting the Nechi of Yisrael Sabbath Tabuna. Achakach Mekabel as Shloshal Partzuvim Hapnimim Shalachaya Shuhu Nikra Gadlu Sheni. And so therefore, the Chaya itself, which is related to Abba Ve'ima Eloyin, which is Chochmah, it's a very high level, it receives that Shehem Neshama Chaim Yechid. I'm going to stop right here. It's going to be Shir today. But let me bring you back over to this idea. Let's see. Where is your output? Now, this is not really the world's greatest idea because it's really just showing you heights and where things are associated. But this is Yisrael's Saba and Tabuna. Excuse me. This is their Anpin. And this is the 10 spheres of Zer Anpin. Zer Anpin starts off just as a Bach, these spheres. And as the lights come in, the Nuranchi comes in. So whatever aspect is coming from the lower level of the Chai Yechida, the Nefesh Chai Yechida, is going to be called Katnus. So we have to find out what are the corresponding Partsufim to Neshama, which he said is Yisrael Sabbath Tabuna. Chaya, which he has said refers to Abba Ve'ima Eloyin, which is right here. Abba Ve'ima, that's Abba Ve'ima Eloyin, and here is Yisrael Sabbath and Tabuna, as we said before, but they're lower. And this Yisrael Sabbath Tabuna enters into Zer Anpin, works on Zer Anpin, not Zer Anpin, here's Zer Anpin. So it's a little bit, this is a two-dimensional drawing, it's a little bit difficult in that way, but we're going to go on tomorrow, we'll see a little bit more and see how we can learn this as a background to what we need to know at the Seder table. This is Baruch Flash.